Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our live Ask the Expert Physician Living with Bipolar Disorder. I want to remind you all that this will be an interactive webinar. So if you're attending through Zoom, please ask your questions in the chat or in the question and answer portion. And we're just going to be answering questions throughout the entire presentation. So ask at any time. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can just leave a comment. Our expert today is Dr. John Budin. Dr. John Budin is a physician living with bipolar disorder and currently serves on the board of directors of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. He has spoken extensively about his experience as both a caregiver and a care receiver at national and international conferences, including the American Psychiatric Association and the International Society of Bipolar Disorders. He is bringing a voice that which has been hidden in the shadows of shame and stigma for far too long into the light of a spoken and healthy day. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to just jump right into it. And our first question, I would just love to know more about your background and your personal story and experience.
Sure. First, it's really a pleasure to be here. I love to do webinars like this, especially ones that are live, where there's an opportunity to engage with a Q&A. Those are the most interesting and the most fun. So what I had said to Emily before we begin is that there is absolutely no question that you can't ask me. I've been asked almost every question that can be imagined. So feel free to jump in at any point and ask whatever question is on your mind. I'm a complete open book at this point. So, in a couple of minutes or so, let me just tell you my story, so it'll put in perspective where I've been coming from, and I guess where I'm going. So in retrospect, I began to cycle up and down in college, although I didn't know that I had bipolar disorder at this point. And neither did I know through medical school that I did. It was only during my psychiatry residency that I began to realize that I was having periods of clinical depression. And so what I did not realize is that I also was having periods of hypomania, which would give me a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. The problem was that, like many doctors, I became my own doctor. So I prescribed myself antidepressants, which in retrospect was a terrible decision because I actually exacerbated the course of my illness. But one of the things that is very important in my story is that I carried a lot of shame and felt that as a doctor, particularly as a psychiatrist, I shouldn't have any psychiatric problems, much less, something like bipolar disorder. So for years, what I like to say is that my bipolar closet door was just nailed firmly shut. I functioned at a reasonably high level. I made it through medical school and residency and established a private practice and ran hospital-based programs. And I was really good, unfortunately, I must say, at keeping all of my symptoms to myself. I almost wish sometimes in retrospect that I wouldn't have been so good at doing that, because I wish I would have come out as a doctor with bipolar disorder earlier in my career. It's to my detriment, and maybe to the detriment of others, that I did not do that. So eventually, after quite some time of treating myself, and I must say treating myself inappropriately with antidepressants and not mood stabilizers, which is what I really wanted to do, which I really should have done, I came to a precipice in my life, and it was a very dark place. Very disturbing things happened to me because I was unmedicated, and it was at that point that I felt like I had no choice but to engage in treatment. It's not an over-exaggeration to say that everything in my life that I had built up was at risk. My my relationship, my friendships, my career, my health, my safety, all of this I had put at risk by being untreated. So I sort of went into the office of my psychiatrist, who I continue to see to this day with my tail between my legs. I did not want to be there. I resented being there. And yet, he was a very good guy, and I followed all of his recommendations. It took a long time. It was about a year and a half before I finally became stabilized. And since then, I have been, with some exceptions, I'd say minor exceptions in my mood, I have been really quite stable. So I decided as a doctor, since there is such stigma in the clinician community against having a mental health condition, I decided to step forward, and at conferences and with my colleagues, I decided to stand up and to say, hey, I'm a doctor, I have bipolar disorder, I am doing well, this is my story, and we need to start talking about this so that other clinicians, other people in the medical community do not suffer. Without going too far afield, the suicide rate amongst doctors is way too high. There are other statistics about medical students and residents that are really scary. There is such stigma against clinicians in terms of stepping forward and acknowledging their diagnosis. So I decided to do so. And I must say, and I'll finish my story here, I must say that I was really surprised at the reaction that I received, because I have received more hugs and affirmation than I could ever have imagined. I expected that I might lose my practice and lose my license and be fired from my job and be on the receiving end of disapproval and chastisement from my colleagues, but none of that actually happened. Now, that's not to say that there aren't real consequences for coming out of a mental health closet. Some doctors and other clinicians really do lose their license. So the consequences are significant, but I think the more that we can speak about this and speak honestly, the better we can take care of ourselves and take care of our colleagues. So in a nutshell, that's kind of like my story. Mine is a cautionary tale. In other words, don't follow me in terms of staying in the closet for that long. I would encourage you to come out a lot sooner than I did. But ultimately, I must say mine is a success story, because I feel like I'm really functional, doing well, getting treated, and things are going really well for me. So that's kind of my story.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. It really is such a refreshing perspective. And one of our participants on Zoom, Steve, he made a comment saying, it is so refreshing that a doctor would be so transparent about his situation. It's great to have someone who has both knowledge and personal experience.
Thank you so much for saying. Thank you so much.
And so moving on, another question that we have is, how do you maintain your adherence to treatment? I mean, being a physician, you are offering advice to individuals. Have you ever struggled with offering that advice or treatment to others, but then not kind of taking that own information for yourself and your own treatment?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Quite a few times, I'm embarrassed to say. As a doctor, sometimes us doctors, we doctors, we put on doctor hats. And if I was going to wear my doctor hat, of course, I would say the things that we all know are helpful. There are three kind of like pillars of health, I think. There's sleep, there's exercise, and there's nutrition. And so as a doctor, I was always advocating that my patients do what they can to sleep well, to eat in a healthy way, and to exercise. And this is something that I would repeat, because I actually do think it's good advice and I do think it helps. But I must say, it was a little tone deaf, because when I was depressed, I wasn't doing those things. I mean, my sleep was disrupted. It was impossible for me to work out. I mean, I really tried, but I simply couldn't do it. And to be honest, I wasn't disciplined enough, when I wasn't feeling well, to eat in a healthy way, like fruits and vegetables. Quite the contrary. I would indulge in sweets and carbs and all that sort of stuff. So it was an interesting dichotomy. I wish in retrospect I might have been able to speak to more of the reality of the situation that was happening with my patients in a more thoughtful way, less as a doctor, but more as someone who has bipolar disorder. I did not come out to my patients as having bipolar disorder. Now, there were many reasons I decided not to do that, and it wasn't because I was ashamed of it, and we can get into that, but there were, I think, legitimate reasons that I didn't. But in some ways, I think I could have been more sensitive to the fact that those who were struggling with being depressed or being manic, I think I could have understood them just a little bit more rather than so much wearing the doctor's hat. And excuse me,
that makes a lot of
I'm
sense.
drinking my iced coffee during the afternoon.
That's okay. We all need a little pick-me-up throughout the day. So with that said, what have you now learned that helps you personally adhere to your treatment? If something happens where you're feeling kind of that moment where you're not wanting to, what kind of brings you back into that reality of, no, I need to keep on,
Yeah,
maintaining my
well,
treatment?
many things. First of all, I have a very good support system, and everyone around me, including my spouse and my friends and my family, and I'm very blessed in that way. All of them help me adhere to treatment. They ask me how I'm doing. They ask me how it's going. I mean, not in every conversation, but they do really support me and help me. But whether it's understandable or not, and whether other people who are living with a mood disorder understand this, believe it or not, one of the greatest motivations for me in terms of taking care of myself is fear. Now, that may be a experience or a feeling that others have had, or maybe not, but I remember very clearly what it was like when I was clinically depressed. And I remember what it was like when I was hypomanic. And those were not good times for me. And I think that in terms of adherence, I would never, ever, ever want to go back there. And so even though I have some side effects from medicines in an ongoing way, and even though I realize that this is a lifelong condition that I'm going to need to be treated for, I weigh that against having my life spin out of control, which it did when I was untreated. And that's a very strong imperative for me to keep in treatment. And I must say, I also have a good psychiatrist who understands that adherence to treatment is not easy. I have struggled with it myself. There have been times when I have definitely not wanted to take my medication or definitely not wanted to show up for appointments. But in general, I've done pretty well, with that. Not 100%, but pretty well.
And so you talked about your having a really great support system. This individual on our Zoom call, she is wondering how she can convince her spouse to see the doctor because he's not admitting to, potentially having something that needs treatment or needs to, go to the doctor. From your experience with your spouse, what could you recommend for the caregiver to do to kind of help offer those different treatment options?
Yeah, I think, I think being a caregiver to someone who has a mood disorder is a terribly challenging thing. I like to think that, and I know that this is actually true, that mood disorders and other psychiatric conditions are not solo journeys. They are often family journeys. And everyone goes along for the ride, whether they want to or not. And so it is very challenging, I think, because some people with mood disorders are ready to engage in treatment, and other people with mood disorders, like me, needed to take some period of time to get ready for treatment. I think that one thing for caregivers to remain to that at least the people around me found helpful was that they ended up having some degree of faith in me. And that wasn't something that came about easily for them. But, the truth is that most of the time, we have pretty good treatments these days, and most of the time, people can feel well. So it's very hard sometimes, I think, as a caregiver to meet people where they are, which at times may be not ready. Obviously, staying with them as best you can during these difficult times and loving them, of course, is the best, that can be done. But that is easier said, than done when you see someone who is not taking care of themselves. So the people that were around me, they stayed with me through thick and thin. And ultimately, my advice to those who are caregivers is that treatment ultimately works. People have to find their own way to treatment when they are ready. And it's important that they have faith to know that at the end of the day, treatment really works. And most people who have bipolar disorder ultimately get to treatment and can do very well.
That's perfect. Thank you. This individual was wondering if you share with your current patients and all new patients your lived experience.
It's a very great question. I retired about 6 months ago. So part of that question, is doesn't apply. But I came out at international conferences while I was still in practice. And so I knew that there was a possibility that there were patients who might become aware that I have bipolar disorder. And there were some patients for whom that happened. Now, I must say I didn't actively share with my patients, and maybe I should have and maybe I shouldn't, and let me explain why. It really didn't have to do with bipolar disorder, and it certainly didn't have to do with the fact that I was ashamed. See, the way that I practice as a psychiatrist is I kept a lot of personal stuff to myself. You see, I thought that, you know, different styles work for different clinicians and different therapists. But what I found is that sharing too much information about me took the focus off what we really needed to do, was to do the work that had to do with the patient. So my patients didn't know a lot about me. Obviously they knew some things, but they didn't know a lot. So my not sharing having bipolar disorder was not so unusual in terms of personal sharing. For those who did find out, I had a range of reactions, as you can imagine. Some people, it just didn't matter to them. They didn't really care one way or the other. Some people actually felt like I might understand them better because I had a psychiatric disorder. I was taking psychotropic medications. I was under care. But I must say that there were a few people who were very upset and very angry, and I understood that. Those patients felt like I should have let them know. Those patients felt like withholding that information was not the right thing for me to do, that I should have disclosed that to them, and they could then make an informed decision as to whether they wanted to see a psychiatrist who had a psychiatric disorder that might become destabilized. So it's a complicated thing, and I respect that some clinicians might make different decisions. I would say this, since I came out of the mental health closet, not when I was 30 years old as a new physician, that if I had to do it over again, I would hope that I would come out that early. And if that were to happen, it's impossible for me to believe that I wouldn't have been completely out and known to my colleagues, to my friends, to my patients, and to the hospital administration. I think that that would have been an interesting life to lead, clinically, and as a clinician, in some ways, to be known, to have it known by everyone that I had bipolar disorder. But look, like everyone else, I came to my decisions for honest reasons that had to do with how I grew up and my own personality and things like that. So I don't really do the shoulda, coulda, woulda thing, too much. I'm happy that I got to the place that I'm at. I have no regrets in that regard. And right now I'm doing well, feeling well, and I'll take it.
Yeah, that's all that matters at this point. Each person has a different journey and a different time when they feel comfortable opening up with it. And it's great
Exactly.
that you've gotten to that point.
Thank
And
you.
with that, when you had kind of come out of the mental health closet, we all know about stigma, but
Yes.
it's kind of curious about if you notice any difference in that stigma in your work environment compared to your personal life, and how did you challenge that stigma in both of those different aspects?
Yes. There was a huge difference. I found in large measure that there was support in my personal life, although there were exceptions. I have two sisters, and one of them has been extremely supportive and the other has not. From the day that, and this was many years ago, from the day that I told her that I have bipolar disorder, she has not mentioned it at all. She won't speak about it. And I understand that as being her struggle, not mine. So it's okay. But in large measure, my friends and my family have been, really supportive. While I have gotten great experiences in my professional life, and I have had colleagues just stand up and give me hugs and affirmations, and when I went to medical conferences to present, I've gotten a lot of pats on the back. Thank you for doing this. But there's no question that the stigma that is present in the physician community is huge. And I must say, while I'm a doctor and most of the times I speak about physician health, it's not just doctors. As you know, there's stigma in the legal community, there's stigma in the social work community, there's stigma in communities of law enforcement, for sure, in the military. So there are many, many communities where stigma is present and it's very widespread. In terms of stigma in the physician community, we do not accept as doctors the fact that we can have mental health conditions. We can't always be blamed for that because sometimes we are bred to be highly competent, efficient, and effective practitioners. And so to be viewed as being quote unquote weak or damaged, which of course is not the case, but to be viewed that way by the medical community is not only not so unusual, but it's something that is often unacceptable. And let me be honest with this, patients expect doctors to be sometimes superhuman. So I think it goes both ways. I think patients can sometimes be helpful and sometimes they can make the challenges a little bit worse. But I think mostly that doctors, that we make it difficult for ourselves because we simply don't have the willingness to sit down and talk about these kinds of issues. And that is why I have been presenting at various conferences and speaking to medical students and residents, because one of the things, in fact, the only thing I think that will really help is to have dialogues about this. There's no way that if we put smart people in a room and we say, hey, how do we solve some of these problems? There's no way that we can't do that. Of course we can. We just have to have the dialogues in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, it also brings into perspective as well men's mental health. You know, it's an unfortunate reality that a lot of men don't feel comfortable admitting to their diagnosis or getting the treatment that they need, somewhat similar probably to doctors, where there's that expectation that you have to be strong and you have to be,
that's right,
that certain kind of that person that everybody else expects you to be. Did you ever feel that coming into play with your own personal experience as well?
Oh, very much, and very much. I mean, I don't want to really go back to the womb, but in terms of my historical history, my history growing up, you know, I was seen as a very self-sufficient, independent, competent kid. I was a parentified child because my mom had recurrent episodes of clinical depression. She was sick, you know, or unwell, I should say, herself. So I became a very parentified kid. And so I learned to not only to take care of myself, but to have a role in the family as not just as a doctor, but as a male, to step forward and be everyone's therapist and doctor and confidant. And that was just what was expected of me as a male in my family. It was less expected of my sisters. So I felt that kind of pressure. And one of the things I did when I came out as a person living with a mood disorder was that I told my family that I'm not doing that anymore, that I'm taking off that cloak, that mantle of being superhuman. Um, you know, I'm not the guy that needs to solve everyone's problem. And this created ruffles and ruffled feathers and bumps in the road in the family. But, you know, ultimately, people got used to it. And I don't do that anymore. It's not to say that I don't try to be helpful, but I don't take those things on anymore. And that I have no regrets about. It's a way that I keep myself healthy, and it has worked, you know, very well for me. One of the things that I believe is that sometimes the truer that we are to ourselves. I mean, I like to say that authenticity is one of the most powerful and freeing things, but sometimes the truer we are to ourselves, sometimes the more we can create bumps in the road for those around us. But I have come to the conclusion that that is just fine. That is just fine. That's what I need, and that's just fine.
That's wonderful. That's really great. Your personal health is what matters most.
Yes.
So kind of switching back to your own experiences. One of our Zoom participants is wondering, did you ever experience psychosis? And if you did, how did you deal with that? How did you move past that?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, my diagnosis is bipolar 2, not bipolar 1. And for those of you who don't know the difference, in large measure, the difference is the intensity and the degree of the elevations. Hypomanic episodes are not as intense in general as manic episodes. Typical manic episodes are accompanied by frank psychosis, delusions of grandiosity, and other sorts of things. Now, that being said, my perceptions of reality, and I think we can put this in the category of reality testing in quote unquote psychosis, my perceptions of reality were definitely altered when I was hypomanic. I believed things that were simply untrue. I believed that I can write novels and plays, and I started to do so. I believed that I was the smartest guy in the room. I believed that I could solve problems and do things that no one else could do. I believed I had sort of, you know, the unique answers, you know, of the world. And so whether that's frank psychosis, I think it really approaches the line, because it is impaired, or it was really impaired reality testing. Now, I must say that I was able, in some remarkable way, which sometimes I still don't understand, to function during those periods. It was evident to some people, but to others, believe it or not, it was not. But I never got to the point where I actually had a psychiatric hospitalization. I came very close to suicide. And had I attempted to kill myself, or had my hypomanic episodes really affected my function in life, then I think I would have ended up in the hospital, and my treatment course probably would have been quite different. I simply wouldn't have been able to hide as long as I did and just stay all closeted up and quiet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing that. So this individual,
Of course.
she has said her son, like yourself, was diagnosed in his first few years of college. Now, 10 years later, he is still struggling with the reality that this is a lifetime disorder. He goes through periods of adherence to treatment, but then falls back into denial as side effects worsen. What was the pivotal moment in your experience where, you know, your perspective shifted and you saw that hope that even though this is a lifetime disorder and a lifelong disorder, that your life will still be great? And what, you know, message of hope can you offer her son?
Well, I think if I were going to offer advice, I would say have faith. And I think that that's very difficult to do. I understand it. It sounds simple and easy, but it is not. I say have faith because, you know, to repeat what I said before, most of the time, people who struggle to accept their diagnosis, many ultimately do. I would say most ultimately do. Remember, the treatments that we have these days, both pharmacological and non-pharmacological, they really do work. The problem oftentimes is that they're tough to take and they're difficult to continue to take. I myself have side effects. I still have side effects, even, you know, at this point, but I navigate my way through them because I know the alternative is to become sick again. And that is not something that I'm prepared to do. So what I would say to this mother is, if your son has had periods of time, maybe years, where he has been engaged in treatment and doing well, that is a really good sign, because he's accepted his diagnosis in some significant way. It's a different story from someone who's never agreed to treatment or who stops treatment after, you know, a month or two. That person may just need to have a longer journey ahead of them. But have faith, because your son has learned a lot already along the way, and ultimately will, based upon that history, I mean, as a psychiatrist, if I saw a person, you know, like your son, what I would say is he's well on the way of accepting his diagnosis if he has had periods of time where he has accepted diagnosis. The other thing I will say is that side effects can be really problematic, and these days we have such a range of medications that my psychiatrist not infrequently would change my medications because I would complain to him that I was having side effects. And so it helps to have a clinician who's responsive, so that your destiny is not just to have problematic side effects in an ongoing way. A lot of people who have bipolar disorder and depressive disorder do have side effects, but mine, for example, are the kind of side effects that I can live with just fine. I'll take it. I feel good, and I wouldn't trade mental health for anything, you know, at this point.
That's a really great point. The side effects can be unpleasant, but the end goal of being healthy is so worth it. And
Absolutely.
so, in light of COVID-19 and everything, you know, our kind of new normal of life, how have you adjusted to this, and have you seen any setbacks in your own personal health? And being a
Yes,
doctor, you know,
yes.
what practices have you learned through your education that you've kind of worked into your life now with kind of
Right,
adjusting to this different reality?
right. Well, as we all know, you know, social distancing and COVID has created a, a mental health epidemic in our nation. So it's not just a virus pandemic, but we have a mental health epidemic. There's no question that the rates of anxiety and depression and other mood disorders are worsened. And that is understandable because people's support systems are undermined, and isolation is generally not such a great thing for people who have any kind of psychiatric condition. I have found a couple of things to be helpful. One, I really do try to connect. And now it used to be just through Zoom, which was okay, but not great. But now I actually connect with friends in person. Now we do that in a thoughtful way and in a socially distanced way, but it really does help a lot. The other thing is that, you know, when we think of the treatment for bipolar disorder, let us remember, while I have mentioned medication many times, non-pharmacological treatments are really, really helpful. I used to attend, this may surprise people, but I used to attend a support group. I tried to get a support group going for doctors, but as you can imagine, so few of them wanted to step forward that it was impossible, you know, to actually get it off the ground. But I have attended a support group, and now that support group is online. So when I can, and it's not infrequently, I log in, and it's a Zoom call, and it is really, really helpful to me. So there are ways to connect in these COVID times that for me have been really, really helpful. I found myself becoming more depressed at first, given all the isolation, and that's why I took some steps to, for me, become more engaged. And it's been really helpful, and it's worked well.
That's great. Yeah, I know that this has been definitely a time when a lot of people have been struggling with being lonely. And
Yes.
it's so important to lean on your support systems, you know, your friends, family, but even people online who you don't personally know. There's always people who want to support you in your journey.
That's right. That's right.
And so moving on, what is the best piece of advice, or, you know, piece of advice that you wish you had been given, um, or that you could offer to an individual who has been newly diagnosed with bipolar disorder?
Well, I would say two things. I mean, I would give the same advice to them that I would give to a caretaker of someone who has a friend or a family member who they're taking care of. I would say, do your best to hold on to faith. And I don't necessarily mean that from a religious point of view. I mean faith that treatment really works these days, and that you have so many people on your side. There are so many people in this world who are good-hearted, and there are so many different organizations that support people who have mood disorders, that you are not walking this walk by yourself. And many times, you know, those who have psychiatric problems, it can be a very lonely experience. It can feel like you're in this by yourself. And the reality, of course, is that that's not true. There are those, whether they're close to you in your support system or whether they're part of organizations, who will be there for you if you're able to reach out, which I know is hard, you know, sometimes. And the other thing that I would say for me is that I came to the realization that authenticity was the most powerful and freeing thing I've ever experienced when it comes to having a mood disorder. Self-acceptance and being true to yourself has freed me from shame. And it was shame that really kept me in the closet for a long time. So the more authentic I am, and I practice that every day, the better it has been for me, you know, in terms of my mental health. I feel very comfortable as a person living with bipolar disorder, as a doctor living with bipolar disorder. And that has only come about because I have been truly authentic to who I am.
That's really wonderful. That is just so inspiring to hear and to know that that's achievable, to be so, you know, showing yourself that self-love and, you know,
Very much. Yes.
self-awareness.
Yes. Yes. It works.
So yeah. So I think that we're gonna have to start wrapping this up a little bit. You mentioned that there are many other support organizations other than IBPF and NAMI. What are
Yes.
some other organizations that you would recommend to individuals?
Well, you know, the organization that I sit on the board of directors of, it's called DBSA, which is the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. It's a great organization, and one of the primary things that they do is they run peer support groups across the nation. And right now there are virtual groups because of COVID, but it's really great in that way. And not only do they have educational materials and they advocate, but more importantly, they offer safe spaces for people who are struggling in an isolated kind of way. In my experience, sitting in a room with other people who have a mood disorder, there is nothing like it. However supportive people can be in your personal life, there's nothing like kindred spirits. And so DBSA has really been great, you know, for me. I'm a big supporter of its mission, and it's a great way to engage in a very personal way. So if you go to the website, you'll see that all you need to do is like click on your zip code and you'll see, you know, what the nearest support group is. So I'm a big believer in that organization as well.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. And as we wrap this up, do you have any final message or thoughts or anything that you would like to share?
Well, I guess first, what I would say is thank you, all of you, who have participated in sending in comments or merely listening. I think it's great. It's an indication that there are so many people of goodwill who are living with mental health conditions, and many of us are living well with mental health conditions. So congratulations, you know, to you. One of the things that I wanted to do before we stop is give everyone my email address. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I love to hear from you. I love to hear your feedback. If there's anything about a presentation that you think I covered or didn't cover or missed or can do better or whatever, please, you know, just reach out to me. I love to be in touch. So my email is pretty simple. It is physicianwithbipolar@gmail.com. So it's physicianwithbipolar@gmail.com. And as well, I have a website and a blog, and I write. I write my stories, you know, every now and then, and that is bipolarphysician.com. So I wanted to give you that information, and again, just to thank you for all being here. those who do not have psychiatric conditions sometimes can't understand that getting out of bed in the morning is like pushing a rock up a hill every single day. And so it can feel isolating. But let me tell you, I have walked your walk. I know your deal. And so many others do. So just remember, you are not alone. So those would be my final thoughts.
Thank you. That was really, really perfect. So
Thank you.
that's all the time that we have. So thank you again, Dr. Budin, for such a wonderful opportunity
My
to
pleasure. It's my
allow our
pleasure.
community, an insight into your lived experience, because each person has such a unique experience, but it's so much easier for people to know that they're not alone in this journey when they hear that other people have walked the same walk that they have. So this has been just so valuable.
Thank you so much.
Of course, this
Thank you
live
so much.
Ask
It's
the
been my
Expert.
pleasure. Been my pleasure. Been my pleasure.
So this recording will be available on our website and our YouTube channel. So I invite you all to visit that if you'd like to share it with your friends and family. Or I invite you to visit our website, www.ibpf.org, to learn more about our upcoming webinars and to stay connected via our monthly e-newsletter where this recording will be featured. And please feel free to email Dr. Budin with his email. I included in the chat in the comments on Facebook, as well as his website, and take a look at all of his offerings. So we thank you all for attending, and we wish you a wonderful week. Bye, you guys. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Bye.